Ladies and gentlemen, buckle up and prepare your minds for the cosmic whirlwind that is episode 2 of season 2 of the Outlaw Crypto Podcast. We've got the indomitable Vlad Costea, the fearless captain steering the Bitcoin Takeover Podcast, and he's here to expose the rotten core of the digital dystopia that's trying to chain us all. Vlad isn't just any podcaster. He's a digital samurai, slicing through the lies and illusions spun by the technocratic overlords. He abandoned the ivory tower of academia, ditching his PhD in political philosophy to fight on the front lines of the Bitcoin revolution. Why? Because he knows the truth. Bitcoin's destiny is to be unstoppable peer-to-peer cash, a beacon of freedom in a world drowning in centralized control. While others sell out to the siren calls of venture capital and state surveillance, Vlad remains a paragon of intellectual honesty. He dives into the murky waters of privacy coins, those misunderstood tools of true financial freedom. In the age of the AI-powered digital panopticon, where every transaction is tracked and analyzed, privacy coins are the kryptonite to the technocratic nightmare. Vlad explores these forbidden technologies, shining a spotlight on the shadows where the real power lies, exposing the sinister matrix of control that seeks to enslave us all. This episode isn't just an interview. It's a manifesto for digital freedom, a call to arms against the creeping tyranny of the surveillance state. Vlad Costea isn't just talking about Bitcoin. He's living its ethos, pushing back against the evil empire of data hoarders and privacy invaders. He's the hero we need in this age of digital deception and control. So join us as we journey into the heart of the digital rebellion, unmask the puppet masters, and reclaim our financial sovereignty. The Outlaw Crypto Podcast is here, and with Vlad Costea on board, we're tearing down the walls of the digital gulag and lighting the way to a future where true freedom reigns supreme.
Welcome back to another episode of the Outlaw Crypto Podcast. I'm your host, Paranoia Machinery. And this is a podcasting 2.0 podcast, which means that you can donate sats, you can stream sats on the Fountain app, and then we also accept a variety of privacy coins if you want to support the show through value for value. Today, my guest is Vlad Costea, who has recently come to the dark side and joined me in the mission of privacy coins and education about privacy coins. Vlad, how are you, man?
Hi. I'm not sure if it's the dark side, but it's definitely the fun side.
Yeah. You've been no stranger to controversy. Like ever since you did the Roger Ver podcast, you've been upsetting the Bitcoin maximalists. Probably since before that.
Oh man, that one sucks very badly because I do an interview every week, right? And I've been chasing Roger for a few months before I actually got him on the show. And it was just a convenient situation that he was launching a new book and he was joining a bunch of shows, and somehow mine ended up becoming the most popular one. And then everyone was blaming me for bringing back Roger. And they started spreading rumors that I got paid by him, that I'm some sort of agent that's part of his comeback, whatever. And it hurts, because you spend 5 years of your life doing this work, and then you try to not step out of line and be nice and not upset anyone. And then you realize that even your close friends, the guys you used to meet at conferences every year and drink with them and have dinner with them and meet their families, stuff like that, they don't even message you to say, hey man, what's going on? What actually happened? Instead, they take advantage of this opportunity to destroy you, to tarnish your reputation, to basically lift themselves on the back of your supposed injury. They think, okay, this guy is not pure anymore. We're going to slay him. We're going to destroy him. This is the end of him. You're not going to hear from him again. Look at how strong I am, really. Because when you do that kind of action, that's how you boost your status among the community. And what they didn't anticipate, I guess, when they did that was that I was going to land on my feet. I'll just keep going what I do best. My audience is not so. Their concern trolling is that when you bring someone like Roger, they're going to confuse newbies. That's their part of the story. That's what they say. But I don't think any newbies listen to my podcast because it was always pretty technical and philosophical, and not too many people care about that. What newbies want to hear is you're smart, you're early, you're gonna get rich, stuff like this, and which hardware wallet to use. I think that's pretty much it. That's the kind of newbie content. And then there's intellectual masturbation with the concept of sound money. I thought you can't make too much content out of it, but it seems like Breedlove somehow specialized in doing this sort of very, how should I put it, pseudo intellectual content where you can just LARP about concepts and find fancy words to describe it, but in fact, it's so simple. I don't know. But bottom line, that was the point when I realized that none of this really matters. And I started asking myself the question, these people, I used to think that they're my audience, they're my tribe. And I realized that they got rid of me so easily. But at the same time, I kept posting episodes in the aftermath of the Roger Ver situation. And I realized that I get the same, if not the same amounts of views, if not more. So I kept going and going. And then I asked myself, why am I still doing this? Is it just inertia? Is it just confusion about my life that I should move on and do something else? But then I realized that I enjoy this, and I found a new purpose for my mission. I realized, okay, I'm this guy. I have this sort of reputation among Bitcoiners. But am I really a villain? Am I trying to destroy anything? No. I just want Bitcoin to work as intended. And I guess it's not nice to reveal some private conversations, but we did talk about this, and you did tell me that you also became disillusioned yourself when you realized that the Bitcoin maximalist hardcore influencer club, the ones who invite you to steak dinners and make you pay for sitting next to them, they are the ones who also lie a lot. And they're also very wrong in their predictions. They tell you, oh, this is going to zero, Ethereum 2.0 is never happening, Monero is a shitcoin, stuff like this. And then you see that the market disagrees with them. And I think I had a similar moment when it reminded me of the moment when I got into Bitcoin, because mainstream media was also telling me that it's dying and there's no point in buying any of it because it's a dead project. Well, when I realized that the market disagrees with the information that I'm being presented, I bought some Bitcoin, and that changed my life. And now I think I'm in a different, or somewhat similar but also different situation, because I decided to also embrace privacy coins, Monero, Zcash, Litecoin with Mimblewimble extension block, and a bunch of others that I find interesting. There's one that actually Roger Ver introduced that to me. He told me, Zano. He said he name dropped it during our interview, and I became curious. And it's basically a platform to create private tokens. And I think that it can be very interesting if meme coins move into this sort of platform where you only know the max supply, but you don't know who owns it and who's trading it. And that can lead to a whole new level of degeneracy where you don't know if someone who is one of the founders is selling or something else is happening. It's sort of zero knowledge degeneracy. But I digress. My point is that I do believe that Bitcoin needs privacy, and I do believe that there's some legit research in this field. And I'm trying to pursue it and see what's interesting out there and to which extent some of it can come back. And also, the thesis is that when you get into privacy coins, you're going to lose money. So I try to create this Freedom Gains Capital Fund. I'm not sure if that's what it's called, but basically, I'm buying some privacy coins every week, and I'm trying to prove that these can outperform Bitcoin. But of course, I need to tweet about it, I need to tell people, and I need to have a story to tell, because this is what's hopefully going to make more people wake up.
First, I want to say I appreciate your commitment to intellectual honesty, because part of like the backlash I think you got from the Roger Ver interview was the fact that you had like the intellectual honesty to take what he was saying and actually listen to what he was saying and consider his information without like that bias of like Bitcoin fanaticism. And then secondly, like the backlash that you received is typical cult behavior. And I think like part of the problem, like a huge part of the problem with Bitcoin is the fact that it's become like an unthinking cult. And the fact that you blasphemed like the cult dogma is why people reacted the way they did. Like rather than have the intellectual honesty to listen to Roger and refute what he has to say with counter arguments or information, people got super butthurt. And I don't, that's like part of why I'm no longer like a Bitcoin maximalist, is because I feel that people have like let their brains go out the window. They're blinded by greed. And like you say, these privacy coins do have technology that could have helped advance Bitcoin adoption. I think if Bitcoin was private, it would have been a lot more successful. With like Monero, for instance, a lot of the technologies that have been incorporated into Monero's privacy features were things that were rejected from Bitcoin development. And I feel like Monero has taken like certain ideas that have solved other problems, like aside from privacy, like for instance, like the adjustable blocks for scaling, or keeping fees low with while the blocks are getting bigger because it's like algorithmically controlled to keep the fees down, the tail emission. There's just certain design decisions that I feel like Bitcoin would have been a lot stronger if the Bitcoin community would have been more open-minded. And like Bitcoin's a weird open source project because it's not really open source. Like with Linux or like any other open source app, like forks are encouraged. Experimentation is like open to anybody. And like with Bitcoin, you have like a cabal of developers and like influencers that are locking down like that aspect of the open source project. And it's unlike any other open source project. Whether that's like a problem of like developer funding and who's funding the developers like remains to be seen, but it's not like any other open source project where experimentation and innovation is encouraged.
I partially disagree because I do interview developers on my show, on the Bitcoin Takeover podcast, and most of them are very open to the idea of having forks, having experiments, observing what they do. It's just that this whole business side and influencer side has decided to take on this idea that everything that is not Bitcoin is a scam. But it's also funny because since I took this turn and I also say, okay, Litecoin is nice because it has this extension block with fungibility built in. And it's pretty cool because you can send coins, you don't know where they come from, you don't see much information. As a matter of fact, on the Blockchain Explorer, you can only see how many coins are locked on this layer. So it's not like the base layer, which is 100% auditable and permanent, and Mimblewimble also makes it prunable. But my point is that these developers are open to it, but they cannot say it publicly, and they know that their incentives are stacked against it because they're not going to get invited to conferences, they're not going to get paid by a bunch of companies, they're not going to be able to play the victim and say, oh no, there's so little money in Bitcoin development and we're not getting funded well. And then you're going to find a bunch of businesses that say they're Bitcoin only, that are going to give them money. So, in a sense, I do understand why they don't publicly express these opinions. But if you do look at the history of these altcoins, you're going to see, for example, look at Dogecoin and see what kind of people contributed to Dogecoin in 2013 or something. You're going to see that some of the top names in Bitcoin development tried some stuff or opened a pull request at least to try something in Dogecoin. Also, Litecoin. The story of activating SegWit involves a Bitcoin Core developer who went by the pseudonym Shaolin Fry, and he was the one who pushed this movement and said, okay, there's a lot of FUD concerning it. Let's prove that it isn't so. Let's prove that not everyone can spend the SegWit output. So there was a lot of cooperation that was open in the past, and now it's hidden under the blankets. You can easily hate Blockstream, but then you discover that they use the confidential transactions that were made by Greg Maxwell and Adam Back, And there was also this guy, Jonas Nick. He was also on my show, and he contributed to a degree to improving Monero's cryptography. And he works for Blockstream, by the way. And Andrew Polstra built Mimblewimble extension block, at least conceptually. And he also took on the idea of Mimblewimble and made it more feasible. So you do have to understand that developers are collaborating, and there's a lot of open source spirit in this. It's just that they don't publicly participate in saying, oh, this is also legit and it's also open source and it has these features, because maybe it's against their incentives. Also, you mentioned that you distance yourself from the crowd of Bitcoin maximalism, and I can argue that both of us are much better Bitcoin maximalists in the original meaning of the term than the guys who LARP all day about Bitcoin only, and they say they only support businesses that only support Bitcoin, even if they're KYC friendly, and they're against any improvement of Bitcoin because they perceive it as some sort of attack and stuff like this. I think it used to be much more nuanced. I think in the past, soft forks could be activated just a few months after they were running on some of these altcoin networks, and developers could see that there are financial incentives to break or find vulnerabilities in them, and they were not found, which means that it's safe. Now they're just presenting you this argument that there are billions of dollars invested in Bitcoin, and you don't want to mess with that because if you have one tiny bug or one tiny mistake, they're gonna be accountable and they don't want to. There's this passiveness.
I think like the like fork, hard fork, like we can never change or update Bitcoin thing is completely overblown. Like you mentioned with the Ethereum merge, they literally switched the consensus model on like a public blockchain that was being used by hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. It happened flawlessly, even though every single Bitcoiner was forecasting doom and gloom for Ethereum and it was going to be the death of Ethereum. And like Monero regularly forks, plenty of other projects regularly fork and upgrade the network. Smart contracts can be like upgraded and deployed again. So like to me that's like not really a valid concern. Like it's like FUD that Bitcoiners use to keep Bitcoin captured and not improve it. And like, do you have thoughts on that?
Well, I think there's a difference in culture and the expectations of the user because these developers, I don't know, for some reason, Craig Wright very much scared them. There's a bunch of them that stopped contributing to the project altogether because of getting sued by Craig Wright. And they're not quite fighters. They're not activists. They're just coders. They're a bunch of nerds who got interested in Bitcoin sometimes because they were weird when they first stumbled upon it and they said, oh, this is so cool. Let me write code for it. But they don't really believe in any mission. And it's very hard in this regard because there's a fight that you must pursue in order to get something to pass, like a soft fork or to lobby to your government, to lobby to the US Congress to make sure that stupid regulations don't pass. And I guess it's too much to ask of them, of this fight. They just write code and then they wait to see what happens. There's this BIP process, which is not very clear and can also be destroyed by a couple of voices. If two or three people disagree with your proposal, it's the end of it. And there's nothing much you can do about it except for go to the miners. And that's the other side of the conversation because the narrative about what Bitcoin currently is that full nodes are in charge and they're the ones telling the miners what to do. But that's not really how Bitcoin works because you cannot tell a miner which transaction they should pick. They can do whatever they want. The nodes are only hosting, they're storing that information and they're waiting for miners to pick them up. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the miner will act in a way which is neutral to the transactions being forwarded by the nodes. And the miners can also activate soft forks by having a simple majority of 51%. So nodes can't do anything about it except for coordinate to have a hard fork. but that's against the principles of the network, right? So it's very interesting in terms of game theory because on one hand, you have these miners who are being shamed for being miners and they're supposedly bad actors because at one point Bitmain, which was a company that was running pools which were controlling more than 50% of the hash rate, they were behaving like assholes. And somehow miners today are trying to prove themselves that they're nice and they're not like Bitmain. And on the other hand, you have a bunch of cocky voices who are pretending that they are in control of Bitcoin because they have a Raspberry Pi. But that's not really how it works, right? You don't really, and then they make the distinction between economic nodes and just simple nodes that anyone can deploy. That's
I
bullshit,
think
honestly.
nodes are useless unless you're mining, like to be honest.
Well, they're not useless because they do grant you some advantages. But
I mean, to
you
verify
shouldn't
like your own
act like
transactions or whatever trustlessly, okay, yeah, but like really, like they have no say in the network at all. Like if miners all want to do something, they'll just do it. And like if you're mining, you can choose to either mine that chain or fork, right? But like
well, you do have a say as a node because you can choose not to update your software to the latest version. So maybe that the developers decide that, for example, there's this full RBF conversation, and the latest version of Bitcoin Core is gonna run full RBF by default. If you ideologically oppose the idea that you can double spend your transactions with a higher fee to either cancel it or accelerate it in the mempool, then you can choose not to run that software. So that's the kind of power that you have as a node. You can say no. You can oppose change.
yeah, but that doesn't change like the network. Like that just means that your transactions won't take advantage of that. The rest of the network is still going to be RBF by default.
Yeah, that's true.
Oh,
Nurse did
like
add it.
yeah. So like basically that's what I'm saying. Like I don't think like running a node does anything. Like maybe like you said you can make a choice on whether you want to update or not, but like other than that, like it doesn't control anything in the network like the miners do. And that's like one of the things the Bcash people kind of like educated me on, because I used to think like, oh, I'm running my own node, like my BTC pay server or whatever, and it was not a mining node, so therefore it really had no control over the network.
Oh
And
yeah,
that's
but
like
you get much better privacy. If you're into that, you must run a node because you're
that's true.
gonna store your own XPub, and the XPub is the extended public key. If you use just a normal, they call them light wallets. If you use Electrum or something else, you're gonna delegate this validation and indexing role to some other node on the network. So if you're not running your own node, you're using somebody else's, and that somebody else is gonna store some information about your transactions. That's the point.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. What do you think about this idea of transparency in Bitcoin? Like, I feel like Satoshi always intended for Bitcoin to be like completely private ghost money, similar to the privacy coins that we are both interested in. I think like the transparency aspect of Bitcoin was more meant to be able to like verify the blockchain, like from your own node or whatever, like through cryptography, maybe not so much plain text or you know, lack of privacy like Bitcoin currently is, where you can see each and every transaction, amount, sender, wallet address, and these kind of things. I feel like Satoshi always meant to have that information abstracted away to make Bitcoin, as unstoppable as possible. And I feel like Bitcoiners have misunderstood that fact of his intention and clung to this idea of transparency, which has been super harmful to Bitcoin adoption and like just using Bitcoin for like censorship resistant transactions in general.
Yeah, let me spin this in another way. We do have a Bitcoin that's private and it's called Monero, and we do have another Bitcoin that's private and it's called Zcash. And it's no different from having a different version of Linux that adds certain features. You can say that you have Debian Linux, and then you have Cubes OS, and you have Tails OS, and you have all of these forks that are engineered in a different way to optimize for a certain use case. Satoshi collaborated with a bunch of other developers to create Namecoin. And that's not something that we talk about too often. But his argument was that it's better to have a separate blockchain that's being merge mined by the same miners, so it has the same thermodynamic security, as opposed to trying to add everything to the base layer of Bitcoin. And that was a reasonable situation. And this also created this world where you have two options to improve Bitcoin. You either add it directly to Bitcoin, or else you create another chain or another network that's going to fulfill that function. And you can argue that it's not Bitcoin because it doesn't use the same base currency, but it is at the same time spiritually Bitcoin because it uses some of the same design choices that were made for Bitcoin but optimized for a certain way. All of these altcoins, they do use blockchains, they do have transactions, they do pay fees, they do have this miner structure, and if they're proof of stake, they still have validators. So much of these forks, you can argue that they are spiritually Bitcoin. And the fact that we don't have everything divided by 21 million and it's going to be divided maybe by 500 million because we have all of these altcoins which are legit and are having proper demand from market actors, I think that's reasonable. It's perfectly fine.
Eric Voskuil would agree with you. I was shitposting around on Twitter and debating with him about privacy in Bitcoin. And I got him to admit that Monero is Bitcoin. It's like an implementation of Bitcoin that is Bitcoin in the sense that it keeps to the same crypto dynamic principles, which you just mentioned. The thing is, the market doesn't see Monero as Bitcoin. And like if you read like old Satoshi emails or him talking to Hal Finney and stuff, like they both like were talking about how important privacy is and how to add privacy to Bitcoin. I don't think they ever meant for it to be like a wide open, transparent chain like this. I think part of the reason that Bitcoin's like stuck in this state of arrested development is because Satoshi like fled and left after Gavin went to the CIA. So like to me, like it's like an unfinished work. It's a work in progress, and like he expected the community of developers to like carry that torch on, and instead they chose number go up and regulatory compliance.
Well, I think Satoshi left because of WikiLeaks, and that tells us a lot about his willingness to fight.
You don't think the CIA was like way more concerning to him than WikiLeaks? I mean, I guess it's the same hornet's nest, but
Maybe, but at the same time, you have a proper reaction that was made by Satoshi when people were saying, "Oh, let's donate money to the WikiLeaks using Bitcoin." And I think it was Amir Taki who came up with the idea. Amir Taki had been a developer until 2015. He was also the first one to come up with this idea of a BIP process. And in some ways, even though nowadays he's very much in favor of adding privacy and making changes to Bitcoin, if you ask him, he is responsible for creating this culture of slowness because he was concerned that Gavin Andreessen is gonna destroy the project with all the changes that he's making with just a handful of people. And he created this process so that he slows down people who want to make changes to Bitcoin immediately because they think it's important.
that's probably been more harmful than beneficial. But Amir's also working on DarkFi now, which is like a privacy coin that's going to have private DeFi. So it's also going to be merge mined with Monero. You should check out DarkFi if you haven't yet, now that you're taking a look at privacy coins. It's an interesting project, supposed to launch in the coming months, and I expect it to
I
be
don't know.
complementary
I
to
don't want to be
Zano.
mean, but I've known about DarkFi for about 4 years now,
Mhm.
and I don't think it's launching that quickly because it was supposed to launch every year since then. I've seen presentations at various conferences about DarkFi, the same story, the same stuff, but they haven't done much. But what they did to their credit was to get a bunch of developers and make everything public, create some sort of dev kits that people can use to play around and build the software from source and participate in the growth of this ecosystem. What they're trying to do
They
basically
they
is to create a
completely
layer.
changed the like whole code base though. Like it was supposed to be like proof of stake at first, and they changed it to like proof of work recently, and it's going to be merge mined with Monero now. So like they radically changed the scope of the project, which is why it's been taking longer than anticipated, I would say.
Well, that's good news for Monero miners. They're gonna make more revenue.
Yeah, and I think like it's going to be complementary to like because there's a push right now for private DeFi, right? Like there's projects like Zano, which you mentioned, DarkFi is another one, Firo is another one that's going to be launching like DeFi on and has like they have a DEX and stuff already. So Particl is another one. Like I expect the emergence of like a multi-chain like privacy coin DeFi ecosystem that people will be, like sending funds back and forth. And like to what you said earlier about meme coins and all this kind of degeneracy coming into privacy coin systems that let you tokenize, I believe that's the future. Like I expect to see like a whole another ICO bubble at some point, but with private tokens that regulators won't be able to impede upon so easily. Like
At the same time, I do hope that it's gonna become very easy to use and create. However, I do doubt it because it was Matt Bitcoins, the podcaster who is running the World Crypto Network. He showed
mhm.
me this website. I think it was called like create NFT.fun or something like this. And all you had to do was just upload your JPEG to a website, add the description, put a name to it, just click a few buttons, and then you made the payment. And you don't need any sort of coins. You can basically pay with your credit card or a bunch of coins that they accept, and they mint it on Solana. And to me, it was mind blowing just seeing how much activity there is there with people who are not technical. They just want to create a joke, and then the joke gets market traction for some reason. And I do hope that these private DeFi projects are going to have something just as easy with one website. You go there, you click a few buttons, and you have your asset. It should not be too complicated because if it is complicated, you're going to eliminate much of the liquidity that's currently pouring into these projects.
We're in extremely early days right now. So like I think Zano just started like having the ability to for users to create tokens on it, like with the latest upgrade. Like they did this thing called Zarcanum or something like that, where it was a fork that finally allowed this capability. So it's only been like 3 months maybe since they did that. This is very, very new. And they're like one of the first chains that allows you, like Firo is still working on it. Particl, as far as I know, doesn't have that capability yet. DarkFi is not out yet, like I said, but we're in very, very early days. But I expect there to be something simple to use at some point in the future, right? Like with Zano to create a token, like you can do it from within the wallet. I think in Beam you can do it from within the wallet pretty easily. Obviously, they're not going to have credit cards because these are privacy coins that aren't going to integrate KYC anything. But like if you hold tokens, you should be able to do it with a couple clicks from within the wallet, at least in Beam and Zano.
Yeah, maybe one that's proof of work is going to allow you to mine enough coins to pay the transaction fee in your browser. That would be very nice if it was possible.
Yeah, Tari is coming out, which is going to be proof of work. I think that one's also going to be merge mined with Monero, which Tari is like Fluffy Pony's like Monero tokenization layer 2 thing. And then, like I said, DarkFi is going to be merge mined with Monero. So maybe somebody will create something like that where you could mine in the browser with proof of work because they're both using RandomX, I guess, right? If they're being merge mined with Monero, which is a CPU based ASIC resistant algorithm. So you can even mine it from your phone. So I don't see why you wouldn't be able to do a little bit of proof of work in your browser to pay your transaction fee.
Well, it sure seems like a great time to be running Monero and mining Monero and looking into privacy projects. I do believe that privacy is the future. And I do believe that it's a great time to look into it and start researching and see what is excellent in this space. because there's a lot of shit always. You get a lot of chains that make dishonest claims about being private, about having this sort of cryptography, about solving the trilemma. Whenever I hear some project that they say that they solved the trilemma, that's how I know that there's something wrong because they're most likely dishonest. If it was this easy to solve the trilemma, which means that you have scalability, you have privacy, and you also have decentralization, I call bullshit on that.
What about Solana though? Like they're not decentralized, I guess, and that's the trade-off they make for their
Well,
high
my question whenever
transaction
Solana
rates, right?
comes
But
into
they still
conversation is how many times did that chain shut down
it
and was
shut down,
started
but I
again?
think those were because technical problems, not because somebody said turn it off. I think
Well,
like it was
what's the difference?
well, the difference is like on Solana, right? Like it's centralized. Like you and I would both agree that it's centralized. Yet they had all those racist meme coins. Nobody was able to stop them, like from being created or traded. So like, is it decentralized enough? Like, are Bitcoiners like fetishizing this like aspect of decentralization because like everyone thinks Solana is a centralized piece of shit, but like they were still able to have like censorship resistant trading. Look at all this like degen meme coin stuff that's going on. Like
Well,
regulators can't
that's only
really stop
because
it.
they're playing the decentralization theater, right? They're pretending that they are, and there's nothing they can do about it. There's all this lobbying industry that says, no, 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 blockchains are immutable. Once you do something, you cannot remove it. So I do believe that they are protected by this political layer of people who try to explain that no, this is really decentralized and immutable and there's nothing you can do about it. But if anyone actually put a lot of energy and resources into destroying it, they could easily do it.
Yeah, but I would say like it's because they know who like the developers and like there's like a company behind it, right? There's somebody to like prosecute or like sue. Whereas like if Solana was like released anonymously and you didn't know who the validators were, like would you be able to stop it, even though it's completely centralized and not decentralized?
Well, that's a good question, but you can always spin up more validators and change the rules and basically perform this Sybil attack where you have more validators and therefore you're able to change the rules for everyone else. I guess it's costly,
Yeah, because
but
you'd have to buy enough coins to like
yeah, they can take them. They arrest people, they take their keys.
that. There's that. Yeah, that's pretty much their strategy for the strategic reserve, right? What do you think about these Bitcoiners that are saying that eCash is a privacy solution for Bitcoin, or that Lightning is private enough for the darknet?
Where do I begin? So I'm friends with Kali, the creator of Cashew, which is the most popular implementation of eCash.
Okay.
And I did interview him on my podcast. I think it was last October during the Hackers Congress. And he did say very explicitly that eCash is not Bitcoin, it's something else. And it doesn't scale Bitcoin. If you want to scale Bitcoin, you do something to Bitcoin. But then I guess he made a presentation in front of some people who were very much enamored with the idea. And they found a way to package it in a way that makes people believe that it scales Bitcoin and it adds privacy to Bitcoin and it removes the inconveniences of the Lightning Network. And therefore, it's the ideal protocol that Bitcoiners should be using until someone rug pulls you, because that's the asterisk. That's something that people are trying to ignore. I got rug pulled myself from one of these wallets
From
because
eCash?
yeah, I was testing it and the application was not available yet in the App Store and it was in this test flight mode on Apple. So I put some very small amounts of Bitcoin in there and I was trading it with Simon from mempool.space, just back and forth to see what's happening. And then I forgot about it and the application got removed and I lost everything. And of course, they had a new version of the application that they deployed on another server, but it didn't have any information about previous owners and coins. So basically, everything that was on that previous server got lost, quote unquote, because of course the custodian took it. So it's funny. There's also Fediment, which is trying to do pretty much the same thing. And when Fediment announced that they're launching last week, I also had a moment when I realized this is all bullshit and all of this, how should I put it, praise that they're getting from the community. I try to find a stronger word, but honestly, it's just praise. But it's hypocritical at the same time because they know it's not Bitcoin, it's banking. They're trying to reinvent private banking. And they think that just because there's a Bitcoiner behind the bank or it's someone with a good reputation within a community, because they're trying to package this and sell it in Africa and say, oh, this is a better way for you to make transactions and have community banks and use this form of money, which is decentralized and is great because it appreciates against your local currency and blah, blah, blah. That's nice. But they're going to entrust this local leader who is going to have everyone's money, and you're gonna assume that he doesn't go to Paris or something or to some island with the money and forget about everyone and never come back, because I'm pretty sure that many of these local leaders would rug pull everyone for a better life in another country.
Yeah, I could agree with that sentiment. I think greed's pretty universal. With Fediment, I guess like the Federation is supposed to prevent that. But like I agree with you that it's not Bitcoin, and I would say the same thing kind of applies to Liquid and Aqua Wallet and
Oh,
these.
and don't get me started on Liquid, but I think they got what they deserve. It's a ghost town. Nobody's using that.
Yeah, I agree. There's a push to try to get people to use it, like to balance channels and stuff like that on Lightning. But 90% of people use Lightning custodially. It's like 99% even. And then eCash is also custodial. Like out of those two custodial layer twos, like if somebody's going to be using it, like we know the majority of Lightning users are not going to run their own node. They're going to be using Wallet of Satoshi or Blink Wallet or something like that. So like out of those two custodial solutions, do you think either one of them is private enough for censorship resistant transactions in like an extremely adversarial environment like the darknet?
I don't know enough about how they work to understand what kind of information the person running the mint can get from these transactions. I understand that they cannot know about the transactions happening within the system, but I don't know much about the peg-ins and the peg-outs inside of eCash and Fediments. Maybe that they do have some information because they can do some network level analysis, and they will most likely collaborate with legal enforcement if they're asked to, because they're companies, they don't really have a choice. So I wouldn't really trust them because the trust model is broken from the get go. You have to trust in a company, and companies are legal entities that have to collaborate with law enforcement. If you're going to be using something like a dark web market, it's probably better to use open protocols that you can audit as opposed to having something which implies a degree of trust in someone else.
Okay. That's the response I expected, which brings me to the larger issue of Bitcoin's value proposition coming from the dark web, like Silk Road making Bitcoin a household name and drawing everyone's attention to it because it was the first like peer-to-peer payment system that you could use for these illegal use cases, censorship resistant transactions, right? That's what the big deal of Bitcoin was. That was the breakthrough. And Bitcoin now, I think there may be one darknet market that still accepts Bitcoin. The rest of them are all Monero only. Like there's other privacy coins. There's even DAI on some darknet markets. Yet Bitcoin has given up a lot of network effect in this sense. Like, do you see this as a problem? Because I think to me that's like the biggest bearish signal that you could possibly imagine.
Well, when there's so much blockchain analysis, it's hard to blame anyone for it. Of course, they're going to say, oh, we don't accept Bitcoin because of the fees and it's unpredictable when we're going to receive the payment because you can pay a small fee right now and then there's going to be a bump and you have to wait for maybe a week until we get a confirmation. This is what they're going to officially say, but at the same time, there is so much blockchain analysis, and as much as we like to deny that it's any good and there's some plausible deniability, it's pretty accurate as far as I could gather information from people. And I don't blame them, you know. If they do want to do that, they should be using something that grants them the highest amount of anonymity. Bitcoin was considered, before these tools were created, was considered to be anonymous. And people, I tell this joke a lot. I even tweeted it about a couple of weeks ago that Monero right now is basically what people thought Bitcoin was when they first got into Bitcoin, with the sole exception of the 21 million supply cap, which I think is unique to Bitcoin. But I don't know, it's a delicate situation. If you want to, if you optimize for privacy, you should use the privacy tools. You should not be dogmatic about using a form of money which obviously does not suit this use case. And from my point of view, it's perfectly fine right now because we have open source software that has been battle tested and can be used for pretty much every use case out there. So the fact that they're going to leave Bitcoin for Donald Trump and RFK and all of these politicians who got on stage a few days ago in Nashville and I was gonna say they sucked our dicks, but it was much more than that because they told us what we want to hear, but at the same time it's very hard to figure out first of all if they're gonna be honest because everyone was there for a fundraiser. They were expecting to get some donations in Bitcoin. Donald Trump, if I'm not mistaken, made about or more than $100 million in the fundraiser that happened in Nashville from Bitcoiners. So it was very productive for him to make these statements. But I don't know, maybe it takes a massive disillusionment or some sort of horrific event in order for the real Bitcoin, BTC, to actually do something about privacy. The way I see it right now, if Kamala Harris wins the elections, the entire industry is gonna get fucked. And I'm saying this very likely because everyone's behind Trump right now. They're giving him money. They're hoping that he's going to win. They are not even considering building a bridge towards the other side of the political debate because there are forces inside of it that want to destroy crypto. There is Elizabeth Warren. There are a bunch of very vocal, what's his name, Brad something, who has been speaking against Bitcoin for years.
Garlinghouse, the guy, the
Yeah,
Ripple guy. Yeah.
no, not Garlinghouse. That's the guy who funded Greenpeace to do that campaign against Bitcoin. Brad something. So this guy has been speaking against Bitcoin for years.
Okay.
And
Is
my
he a
point,
politician?
yeah, he's an elected representative in the House of Representatives, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not familiar with him then.
Anyway, my point is that once these people are gonna have their way and they're gonna be in a position where they have the executive power to pursue these businesses and take them out of the US, it's going to be interesting because we're going to be in a position where the thesis for making the number to go up is going to be invalidated. There's going to be a need for something else to emerge, a new use case, and we're going to have a shift in terms of narrative. On the other hand, if we do have Donald Trump winning the elections, he might be more open to it, but I don't expect anything miraculous from his administration. So, in a sense, maybe it's good for US businesses, and we're going to have a continuation of the current model. But it can also be a big disappointment where once he sees himself in office, he's only going to follow the agenda of the deep state, you know? It's not
Yeah.
really about what he wants or what he says he wants. It's about some greater interests of bureaucrats who are at the White House and in Washington for their entire career, no matter who's in office. So
Yeah,
we do
like
have
I'm
to
a full
consider that.
believer in the uniparty of the United States. Like I think both parties are pretty much like two wings of the same bird, as they say. And I don't expect too much of a like variance in policy from either administration. One thing that I found interesting was like last week I was listening to this Linux podcast on Jupiter Broadcasting. I can't remember the name of the podcast, but I was listening to it about the CrowdStrike thing, the Microsoft like bug, right? And while I was tuning in for that topic of conversation, they went off on a tangent and started talking about Bitcoin and how Coinbase and like the Winklevoss brothers and Kraken, like they these big businesses for crypto in the United States, like feel like the SEC has been hostile to them, and they have like pooled their money together and started organizing politically and purchased like a ton of lobbyists and put a bunch of money behind them. So now like the crypto lobby is one of the most well-funded lobbies in Washington, and that's kind of like why the Biden administration had this about face. It wasn't because Trump came out pro crypto and forced them to kind of like change their stance. That was part of it, obviously, but the major reason that the Biden administration changed their stance apparently was because crypto is now like one of the most powerful lobbies in Washington D.C. I don't know how true that is, but I found that very, very interesting. And it leads me to believe that even if Kamala Harris is elected, there may be like a lot of money influencing the administration's stance on how they treat crypto moving forward.
To me, it's interesting that we got to this point where it's such a big talking point. It's only been 15 years since Bitcoin was launched, and it's so significant. For me, it was a mind blower. But at the same time, you have to ask yourself the question, how come all the people who 8 years ago or even less than 8 years ago were against Bitcoin are your friends right now or pretending to be your friends? And some of us got into this specifically because they wanted to get away from the political system, which they thought was too corrupt and not as intellectually honest as an open source project. And then we find ourselves having this alignment of incentives and having the perfect storm where you get someone like Trump getting on stage and agreeing with you when in fact he was against it and he called it a scam. And it's very hard to figure out where this is heading. I do believe that David Bailey, the CEO of BTC Media and also the owner of Bitcoin Magazine, is the new master of puppets. He was able to put so many politicians together to speak the agenda that he wanted. And there's a lot of power to that, but it's also a single point of failure. Because if that side of the political spectrum does not win the elections, he's going to be in a position where probably he's going to move the business out of the US. I believe that there's going to be some sort of persecution of those who funded Trump's campaign and were pro Trump if the Democrats are winning the presidential elections and they also get the majority in both houses. So it's difficult because we added an extra layer of risk, which you can argue was inevitable. We were going to get to this level where businesses get so big and they make so much money that they do have to buy themselves some time and some clemency from the administration, which of course is going to be hostile to any change. But then there was always this discussion of why is gold mining and the oldest gold industry not receiving any frowns from the politicians, and nobody complains that gold is destroying the environment. Well, you can go back in history and see that gold has been around for such a long time that people just accept that it's valuable and there should be fracking, there should be these techniques to extract it. But on the other hand, maybe it's needed to finance these lobbyists because the gold industry has been doing this. They have been buying politicians and lobbyists for a long time. Same for the oil industry, same for a lot of these businesses. So I guess we're finally big enough to play on this stage. I'm not sure if we're ready to play on this stage, but we're gonna see. My hedge is through privacy coins and realizing that, okay, these are more censorship resistant and they're fungible. And I do believe that in a future that's uncertain, they are a pretty good bet.
Yeah, I would agree. And I also think like the importance of focusing on peer-to-peer cash is like super important. I think that's where Bitcoin like kind of went wrong. Like now that it's nothing more than a like commodity that bankers are going to invest in and like hedge funds and these ETFs and stuff, like it's no longer for the people, which was the whole point, right? So like privacy coins that focus on being cash, like digital cash. And there's more than one of them. It's not just Monero. Like obviously there's Grin, there's Litecoin with Mimblewimble, there's Zcash. There's a bunch of privacy coins that can be used as peer-to-peer cash. But like when people like if there is some terrible event, as you mentioned, that forces people to like seek out privacy, they're not just going to seek out one privacy coin. It's going to be like a flood, like a stampede, and they're going to go into every single like privacy asset. And hopefully there's like a peer-to-peer economy that comes along with it, because if we have privacy coins but they're we still have to like opt in to KYC to like transact or this kind of thing, then it kind of defeats the purpose. Like privacy coins need to maintain like this outlaw like parallel system that cannot be co-opted, or else we're going to be in the same position as Bitcoin with privacy
Well,
coins.
I come from a different background, you know. Before I was born, my country was communist, just 3 years before I was born.
Mm.
And there was a lot of surveillance and control. And it was 12 years ago that I read 1984 by George Orwell for the first time. And that was also a big eye opener in regards to what a big government can do to you. And the truth is that every transaction that you do on the Bitcoin blockchain is permanent and it's open. So maybe that you think that you have perfect privacy, you have done your coin join, you have done a coin swap and then another coin join, and then you got on the Lightning Network, and then you closed your channel and you think that your coins are perfectly untraceable, but then you're gonna make a payment to a service that requires you to put a name to your purchase, you know, or at least an address for your purchase. That information is going to get transmitted further to an exchange, probably. And these exchanges have a lot of data. I think Edward Snowden said this in his presentation that in the US there is no proper protection against invasions of privacy. Basically, there is the Fourth Amendment, which is supposed to protect the citizen from the state, but the workaround is for having corporations to collect the data, and then the government just purchases the data from these corporations or makes some sort of deal that they reveal the information that they need. And it's getting pretty Orwellian. And the only kind of information that is really private and protects you from an oppressive big government is the one that's not collected. So it's better to use protocols and software that protects your privacy and collects as little data as possible, as opposed to just saying, oh, but I want to only use Bitcoin, which is going to leave a permanent trace on the public ledger. And more than this, you're going to deal with businesses that are over-regulated and super compliant, and they're going to know everything about what you're doing. It's a pretty terrible design, and that's why I'm such a big advocate of adding privacy to Bitcoin, and I'm open to researching other types of protocols that are doing something else. It's a long fight, but someone has to fight it, you know?
Yeah, I agree. And then have you gone far enough down this road to consider if Bitcoin will ever add privacy? Like, I don't think they will. I think the incentives are no longer aligned for privacy being added to Bitcoin.
I think there wasn't any major catastrophe or event that made people realize that this open ledger design is no longer what's needed. I think they were complacent. I think it was necessary, honestly, from a political point of view, to convince politicians that there's nothing evil about Bitcoin because look, you can see every transaction, and look, you can regulate the on ramps and the off ramps so you can know who's buying and when they're selling, even if they have some private transactions in the middle. But once we get past this point, I think there's gonna be some sort of event that's going to make it desirable for Bitcoin to be private because there's no other way it can be fungible. There's
For
no
me,
other way.
that event happened already, and it was when the Canadian truckers got their Bitcoin seized. Do you remember all the donations that people tried to
I made
send
one
to?
myself, yes.
Okay. Do you remember how J.W. Weatherman and some other Canadian Bitcoiners like basically bungled the whole thing and got the Bitcoin seized by the police, and then like people that had exchange accounts in Canada got their like accounts frozen with their Bitcoin still in it, and then their bank accounts were frozen, and GoFundMe and like all these platforms for donations like basically blacklisted them. Like, do you remember all that taking place?
That was very messed up. I don't know all the details, so I don't want to accuse a single individual or group of individuals of doing anything. But it was messed up because the way in which they tried to do it was to have these envelopes that they were handing to the truckers, telling them, download this wallet, write down the seed words on this sheet of paper, and then you're going to be able to use these services and transact like this in a non-custodial, uncensorable way. That was the ideal behind it. They could not pull it off because I guess they had some people who either did a very bad job or they did a very good job for the government. So maybe it was incompetence, maybe it was sabotage, but it did not work. And it was also, how should I put it, hidden under the rug in the sense that there wasn't much conversation about what happened. Some people apologized, like Ben from BTC Sessions, because he was a big spokesperson for the movement. And he said that he messed up, but he had no control over the funds. He just told people that they should donate. And then everyone forgot about it and moved to the new thing because we were living pretty crazy times. And then there was the war in Ukraine, and then you had all of these world events that made you shift your attention from what previously happened. I still can't believe how easily we got over the situation with Samurai developers and Wasabi shutting down and Phoenix Wallet no longer being available in the US and a bunch of other wallets saying, oh, we're going to withdraw
Mutiny is
from the
the
US.
latest one.
Yeah, I used to call these sacrifices on the altar of 100K because these people believe that the more compliant we become, the easier it's going to be for institutions to buy in and pump our bags, right? But it turns out to not be the case. Of course, they're not stupid. Of course, they know how to use this advantage of buying paper Bitcoin in a way that doesn't really affect the price on exchanges, because that's what we generally refer to as the price. It's just an aggregation of exchange prices. They do know how to buy OTC. They do know how to move the coins in a way that at the same time doesn't create too much scarcity and demand to create a spike on exchanges in terms of price. So they know how to play this game. And right now we're subjected. We used to joke that Bitcoin trades 24/7, and that's still true. But the big money moves from Monday to Friday, from 9 to 5 in some super regulated entities in the US. That's where it's even funny to see accounts from guys like Adam Back and Tour de Meester and a bunch of others doing just analysis of what happened with the ETF inflows and saying, oh, there's this volume and we expect a price bump because of this. It's insane. I used to think that these people are cypherpunks, and now we look at institutions and hope that they pump our bags. This is really not why I got into Bitcoin, really.
No, that's what I'm saying. Like, and that's why, like, a lot of these problems that we've talked about stem directly from the fact that Bitcoin is not able to be used in a censorship resistant way due to its lack of privacy. And this whole like push towards compliance has destroyed Bitcoin. Like, I think that's probably
No, wait. Let me
more
give you the
destructive.
maximalist response for that. Of course, it's censorship resistant. You can send a transaction and it's going to be mined into a block. The fact that something happens to you after it gets added into a block is not Bitcoin's problem. It's your problem.
Yeah, the
TikTok
KYC,
next
it
block.
has nothing to do with Bitcoin. Like, it doesn't matter that like they're going to use that to seize your Bitcoin or like arrest you. That's outside of Bitcoin. So Bitcoin's private still. Like, that's the kind of like just retarded logic that Bitcoiners will come back at you with when you point out these like very salient problems that Bitcoin is dealing with. And like, I think it's the lack of privacy. And I know
But
that
everything is good
because
for Bitcoin, right? It doesn't matter what happens. Everything is
not
good for
being
Bitcoin.
private isn't. That's like partly why I think so strongly that when Satoshi left, it was like a work in progress that never got finished. And like, rather than finish the privacy aspect of it to make it truly unstoppable, they pivoted and tried to go this like mass adoption route, which like I think crypto's never going to be mass adoption. It's always going to be like the fringes of society. Like, the people that seek freedom are not mass adoption people. The people that hold privacy important are not like the mainstream person. It's a very like niche group of people. Like, worldwide, yeah, sure, there's a lot of us. There's probably, a couple 100 million people that are concerned about that, and that's enough to, I guess, create like a parallel economy if people actually used crypto as P2P rather than like a speculative commodity. But like, I don't think they're ever going to add privacy to Bitcoin. And that's why like I've moved on and started focusing on privacy coins. Like, to me, like, Bitcoin is a failed experiment at this point.
You're Mike Herning right now, but I
Yeah.
just wanted to point out that this argument of mass adoption and the fact that nobody really cares about Bitcoin outside of maybe a small group of libertarians, this was introduced during the 2014 bull market when they decided they should build what they called at the time meta protocols for assets. So they were saying, okay, nobody cares about transacting BTC, right? So why don't we build stable coins? They built this on Mastercoin, which became the Omni layer on top of
Hmm.
Bitcoin. And every transaction with Tether was a Bitcoin transaction. So it was using BTC as the transaction currency. They were paying a fee to the miners in that one. And then they had different types of assets that were being sent out. And then they also created Counterparty, which was this protocol that was supposed to create assets and allow companies to launch their shares and become truly sovereign on the internet and decentralized, secured by the Bitcoin network. And then it ended up only being used
Rare
for
Pepes.
memes, rare preppies, exactly. I think this is just a consequence of being too early and having great ideas too early because the same concept ended up laying the foundations of Ethereum. And I think Ethereum took a long time to actually make sense. Right now, I think Ethereum is the largest and most successful layer 2 for Bitcoin, as proven by the amount of WBTC, because it's bigger, like orders of magnitude bigger than Lightning and Liquid and Rootstock and everything else combined.
And
And
those wrap BTC go to like a plethora of other Ethereum compatible chains also. So it's
yeah, it's really insane on one hand, but on the other hand, it makes sense. If you're not going to scale this base layer, you're going to get other networks and people building bridges between them. And I think those who understood that this is the way to go and that's the future are the ones who made a lot of money and are super successful today. Like you can argue that Jeff Garzik is a traitor, right? He's the creator of Segwit 2x. He's the one who coded it. But as soon as he realized that it's not happening and Bitcoin doesn't get a block size, he said, okay, I'm going to work on bridges. And at the time, it was a bold assessment to think that you're going to have bridges between chains. But he was right. This
That
is the
stems
future.
from the unconventional nature of the open source project that is Bitcoin, though. Like, if Vitalik never would have made Ethereum if he was allowed to experiment like he would have been able to in any other open source project within the Bitcoin open source project, right? But because like at that point in time, like I feel like the banking interests had already moved in and kind of like co-opted development and put these key people in places in Bitcoin Core that were hostile to any sort of experimentation or advancement of the technology. Like altcoins would, all that development would have been on top of Bitcoin. Same thing with drive chain. Like, look how long Paul's been trying to pass drive chain. Like, it's been almost a decade. Like, it's been 9 years. Like 2015 is when he like published his paper or something like that, right?
Well, yeah,
So
but
like,
the paper was very vague, and he hired Luke Dash Jr. to make it more BIP worthy, and he also paid a bunch of coders because until a few months ago he didn't have like proper public clients that you can run and you can test. He launched the Signet version of Drive Chains, and now you can download that from, I think it's drivechains.info, but also layer2labs.com. And you can see how that's supposed to work. You can transfer your BTC on the Signet from one network to the other, from base layer to this Zcash sidechain to an Ethereum sidechain, and there are a bunch of others that you can use for experimentation to see how it actually works. And honestly, it's cool, but he didn't have the code to deliver anything. He just had the idea that he presented. And I think a lot of people misunderstood the proposal. Even Peter Todd, when I interviewed him, he said that Drive Chains is an attempt to increase the block size. That's the way that he sees it, because it's good for scaling. But in reality, it's much more than this. It's a way to attract developers from around other ecosystems and make them come to BTC and build on top of a layer that uses BTC, the currency. And in some ways, it makes sense because of the network effects and the brand recognition and everything else. Because if you're going to experiment, it's much easier to have a drive chain than to start a new network of your own. And you're also going to contribute to the long term sustainability of this project. But he does have a lot of opposition. And the biggest concern that is still not beaten is about miners being able to pick which transactions they want to include in a block, and therefore you're going to pervert their incentives. And the way to solve this is to have confidentiality of transactions. So if you're
exactly,
going to
to have
have
privacy.
privacy in Bitcoin, you're not going to have this MEV concern because all transactions are going to look the same to them. And honestly, that's my goal right now, to make sure that all transactions are going to be the same. That was the promise for Taproot, by the way. If you remember that, they were saying, oh, chain analysis is obsolete because right now all transactions are going to look the same. I'm still waiting for that one.
Yeah, I think there's like a problem with that though. Like, I've asked people about that, like developers, and they've told me that like when they did the Taproot fork, like they didn't add the signature aggregation, which was supposed to be like what made like coin joins were going to be cheaper than like a regular transaction, because you would be able to aggregate all these signatures from everybody in the coin join, and it would look just like a regular transaction, and it was going to make privacy like flourish. And then yeah, they didn't put that part in of the fork, right? So
I think that's CISA, cross input signature aggregation, which is a different software proposal, which seems to not be happening. Now they're talking about covenants.
yeah, like, so I don't know, like I'm not technical enough to dispute the merits of the different covenant proposals, but it seems like among the developer community, like people just want something like that will allow them to have a little bit better smart contracting, because like all the proposals for like these projects like arc and like ecash mints that are non-custodial, like all these kind of things could be done with covenants, I guess. And right now the community's debating on it, but like the fact that Bitcoin's not a normal open source project, and that you have to like get your ideas approved before you can act on them, is like really what's holding it back. Because like we just discussed, like all this development from all these altcoin ecosystems would have taken place on Bitcoin. All that innovation would have been happening on Bitcoin. And now it's like too little too late. Like if drive chain gets implemented, I don't think a bunch of developers are going to leave their altcoin ecosystems. Like these communities that have spawned up are just as like fanatical about their coin as Bitcoiners are about Bitcoin. And like
Well, I
because
disagree with you
maximalism
because
is toxic. Like a lot of people have resentment towards Bitcoiners, and they're never going to go back to Bitcoin.
look at what happened with ordinals and the fact that this protocol launched on Bitcoin and it ended up destroying a multi-million VC funded industry of NFTs. NFTs have
Yeah, but
never
I
been the
mean,
same since ordinals came around,
are
and
ordinals even a thing though anymore? Like, it seems like NFTs in general died, and ordinals were just an NFT that also died.
they never die. They're on the blockchain permanently.
Well, I
It's
know, but
just a
like the
matter of time
interest,
until
I guess.
someone
Like it seems like the
realizes
interest for NFTs like died and became interest for meme coins this cycle. Like NFTs were
that's
last cycle.
fine. It's like saying Pokemon cards are no longer in fashion because there is no new season of the Pokemon cartoon. But who knows, many years from now, when someone's gonna get nostalgic about these assets, when there's gonna be much more market action.
There's supposed to be more ordinal stuff. Like uh Casey's like still working on like his runes thing, and then I was playing around with I was participating in an airdrop with Unisat, which is like MetaMask, but it's for ordinals. And like there was, do you remember like the testnet got all messed up because people were like buying and selling the actual testnet tokens? It's because
Yeah,
these
that was
airdrops with
funny.
these ordinals that were happening. Like people were buying the testnet tokens to participate in the airdrop. You needed the testnet tokens. And like the apparently that like these dexes and stuff for ordinals are going to launch, and I expect fees to be out of control like when they do. I don't know like what is going on with it because I'm not really following ordinals too much these days, but like to me like the whole like NFT craze like on Solana, on Ethereum died, and then ordinals it went to ordinals for like a brief moment, but then it died and everything kind of just went back to Solana for meme coins. I don't know if NFTs are going to live up to their hype. You know, like people were talking about NFTs being in video games, and like brands and celebrities and all these people were trying to like get in on the NFT train. Like, do you think they have staying power?
Well, there's still, so for example, there's Square Enix, which is a legit video game development studio from Japan.
Yeah, I love RPGs from Square and Enix.
And they did invest in this project, which is going to have NFTs as part of the core mechanisms of the game. So I don't think they're gonna go away. It's just that the market demand is lowering, over time. But it's gonna have inflows, and then it's gonna have moments when everyone forgets about it. I don't think it's gonna go away in this sense. But I presented the case of ordinals for the purpose of explaining that there is genuine demand and interest for people and builders to come and do stuff on Bitcoin once they have the proper infrastructure to do it. Because you say, okay, you don't think Ethereum developers or Zcash developers are going to come to Bitcoin to work on these drive chains. Well, we have a precedent for it. And we do know that there is this race where everyone wants to accumulate more Bitcoin, whether they like to admit it or not. It's the zero sum game for the 21 million, and everyone is set to get more of that.
I don't know if I necessarily agree, and I also don't think like stable coins are going to come to Lightning. Like I think all these things are too little, too late. Like if they would have done drive chain like in 2016 or whatever, like yes, I could have seen that drastically impacting altcoins and development taking place on Bitcoin. Now that there's like people that are into like their chains, it's so tribal that you might get some, but I don't think it's going to be like this massive flood of innovation on Bitcoin again because now there's drive chains. And I honestly don't think that the network effect of Tron is so strong for Tether, and like Matic for cheap fast Tether. Like these things are not going to just no longer have volume now that Bitcoin has Lightning stablecoins. Like I don't think it's too little, too late. Like they should have done that shit like 5 years ago.
I guess that's the elephant in the room, right? Because we can LARP about what we want, but on the other hand, there's this market action on Tron with Tether that proves to us that what we want is not necessarily what the rest of the world wants.
Yeah, I share that sentiment, like something that you said earlier when you were talking about Fedimint and how they're in Africa and they're trying to get people to use Fedimint eCash in Africa. Like that's never going to happen because people in Africa, like I talked to Ray, the CEO of No One's, the peer-to-peer exchange that's primarily in Africa, in a different episode on this podcast, right? And like he was telling me like they need like a medium of exchange. The problem that people in Africa have is that African countries are like economically isolated from each other. Like if you live in like Nigeria, you can't trade with the neighboring country because there's all these capital controls and like regulation and rules. And like even if you have like M-Pesa, which is like a cash app kind of app in Africa that's popular for like peer-to-peer payments, like if you have it in Kenya, you can't pay somebody that also has M-Pesa in the neighboring country because of the way the regulations are set up. And that's like a holdover from colonialism where like they basically split Africa up against amongst these colonial powers like Portugal, France, the United States, the UK, and like they don't want Africans to empower themselves economically because they want to be able to strip these countries for all the resources. So like these rules have been in place like since this era of colonialism, and what African people need is the ability to like pay somebody like in the next country or send money, to someone in the next country like as a remittance without paying like 30% of the amount that you're sending. And that's why they're gravitating towards Tether. It's not volatile. Like if you only make like $100 a month and you lose 50% of your $100 because Bitcoin took a shit price wise, that's devastating. So first of all, they want to stay away from volatility. Second of all, they need to just be able to transact quickly, cheaply, and with no intermediary, which is what Bitcoin's supposed to be. But Tether has accomplished that better. And that goes back to the thing where like, yeah, Tron is a centralized blockchain, but is it decentralized enough? I know Tether itself can like freeze transactions if they find them to be suspicious or whatever, but like for the most part, they're not impeding on this peer-to-peer commerce that's taking place in Africa. And like that's the main reason why nobody's ever going to use eCash in Africa and why Bitcoin is losing its market share like in emerging economies and peer-to-peer adoption.
Well, let me put out the Bitcoin fixes this meme and just
Okay.
tell you to lower your time preference and tell you that, oh no, you're just wrong. Let me go to these African people and tell them that they're wrong, and they don't know what they want and they don't know what they need, and I'm gonna show them. And if it goes down, it just means that they should hodl. And if they can't hodl, then they have no conviction.
The only place that Bitcoin's made any headway in Africa is in South Africa at Bitcoin Akasi, right? And all the usage of it is Lightning and it's custodial.
It's the same in El Salvador right now. And I did read a tweet from someone who was saying that he went to a store and he wanted to buy socks for like $10.
Oh, I saw that.
And he had to show his ID for a purchase that is of only $10. It's insane. That country is turning into a dictatorship so fast. And there are still people who are trying to find excuses for it.
Have you been there personally? Have you had a chance to go?
I was supposed to go, and then I got sick. I had my second COVID and I wasn't feeling right. And I was supposed to be on stage to moderate a panel. And I couldn't go, and I had paid for my hotel. They didn't want to reimburse any money. They didn't want to accept Bitcoin either. I had to send them a wire transfer, which I thought was funny. And I also didn't want to use law enforcement, because I could easily just complain about that hotel not accepting Bitcoin because it's supposed to be legal tender, and then basically make the police go to their HQ, to their building, and make them accept my payment. I just didn't want to go through this
I don't
process.
think it's like that. I think like they have the option. Like in the law, like itself. I don't think they can be forced to accept it.
Well, in this context, since it was about this foreign tourist coming from a different country who was about to bring in some extra economic activity, I guess they could pull some strings just for the purpose of making this hotel accept, even if it was someone saying, okay, we're gonna give you the dollars, just pretend that you accept it and I'm gonna receive it. Anyway, I didn't want to go through these hops. I respected their right to choose their customers and choose the currency that they want to accept. That's part of being a libertarian, but I guess we forget so easily what freedom is supposed to be about. But I've always disagreed, and I still believe that this El Salvador Bitcoin affair is a huge CIA experiment because El Salvador is a country that accepts US dollars and has been using the US dollar as its legal tender. Then you had this American guy who runs a business called Strike, who comes along and says, "Yo, I spoke with this president and they're going to pass this law to accept Bitcoin as legal tender." And then there was no backlash from the US government. Nobody said, "You're trying to compete with our dollar." Remember the last time someone tried to do that in the Middle East to change the dollar for something else? They sent their warships and tried to put some more democracy in there. Now you have this country that's in Central America, very close to the United States, that's trying to replace the dollar with something else for payments. And then you just sit and watch and say, okay, let's see what happens. There's something suspicious in there because there was not enough backlash. There was no investigation on Jack Mallers to see whether or not he's trying to work with other governments that are not friendly with the US for the purpose of diminishing the role of the US dollar in the world. But I guess there's a reason why Strike, after this historic moment in El Salvador, began being more embedded into the traditional financial system to the point where right now I'm not even sure if they use Lightning anymore for payments. Maybe
I
it's
don't know.
part
I
of the
know they have
interface.
Tether. Tether's part of it for sure. Like I don't know about the U.S., but I know like outside of the U.S. in the Strike app, there's Tether for sure.
I've never used Strike for the simple reason that it was not available in my country when I was interested to use it. And now that it's available, I don't need it. I'm not curious to try it anymore. I guess it's fine for what it tries to do, but if you think about it, Jack Mallers last year or 2 years ago got on stage and had this very nice video where he was paying from his home node running Tor, and he was saying, "Look at me, I'm making this perfectly anonymous payment, and I'm buying Coca-Cola," and he called it Coke over Tor. He was
Hmm.
saying, you can do this with Strike, and you could never do that with Strike. He announced this project, this product for his company, and it was never actually brought into fruition, which
He also
is
said he had that
disappointing.
partnership with like all the big brands. Do you remember? He was saying that it was going to be in thousands of stores. Like you could pay with Strike and use Lightning, like in like supermarkets and like chains and all this stuff. And that never manifested itself either.
Honestly, I would not be surprised if Strike follows the steps of Swan in terms of laying off a bunch of employees and downsizing its operation because it's still not clear to me how they're making money. In the case of Swan, it was more obvious. They're an exchange. They're buying Bitcoin from a custodian and they're selling it at a premium to a bunch of guys who feel more pure if they buy it from this place. And somehow they're not able to keep up and make enough money to keep all the employees. But I think it was because of their expansion into mining. Still, that's
Hmm.
a more clear
I think it
business
was because
model.
they mined with Ocean, and Ocean's not a profitable mining pool since they are trying to censor transactions. Like
They're so pure that some of the blocks they mine have zero transactions, which
that's
is
what I'm
funny.
saying. Like for miners to leave money on the table, that's like antithetical to mining. Like the miners are supposed to like be purely motivated by self-interest and greed, and by doing so, like their incentives align with the network's security, right? Like to leave money on the table because you want a virtue signal is not a successful business strategy if you're going to be a miner.
Of course not, but they're gonna have to learn the hard way. For me, it's suspicious that pretty much every company that Jack Dorsey backed in terms of Bitcoin stuff, I don't think there's one of them that's profitable right now.
Yeah, maybe Primal.
I don't know what that is.
It's like a Noster client, but like it has like a wallet in it, and they KYC you. So
Oh, so
it's
you think that one is gonna be successful because it gets customer data? Maybe. But when you think about it, he has a hardware wallet that is a flop. It was selling for like a quarter of the price not too
I
long
saw that it
ago.
was like $150 when it launched, and then now it's like $25 or something.
Yeah. And it's not even a great device. It has no screen. There's no way for you to verify what transaction you're making. It's a signing device that you have to blindly trust that it's operating in the way that it claims to be operating. And he also has his investments in that LDK, Lightning Development Kit. There is a company behind it. I don't remember the name, Circle or something.
Okay.
Spiral, that
Spiral. It's
one.
Spiral. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. I don't think that one is profitable. I'm not sure what's the long game. Of course, he has a lot of money and a lot of patience for these projects to grow, but none of them, as far as I can understand, became profitable. Just like Blockstream, they raised a lot of capital and they said we're gonna deliver the sidechain, which was their research, and then they came up with this half-assed solution, which is a federation. And it was funny to me. I had this interaction with Luke Dash Jr., who I think is a founding member of Blockstream, but someone who doesn't work for them anymore.
Hmm.
I think he's mentioned in the white paper for sidechains. And I told him, is this cypherpunk if you have a bunch of companies that are from different countries and you're supposed to trust them? And he told me, well, at least in the case of companies, there is someone you can sue as opposed to the miners who are harder to identify and harder to, you know, get them in a court of law. I was like, so basically, the trust model or the security model for the entire system falls back on the nation state. We hope that the nation state is going to provide to us the justice that we need to solve our disputes, and that's liquid. Instead of going to the miners, who are actually this decentralized group that anyone can join. I can be a miner, you can be a miner. It's all a matter of participation. Of course, we're not going to make much of a difference unless we get a lot of gears and we have efficient electricity that we can use. But the point is that this mining scene is dynamic. You don't have one entity that can monopolize by virtue of owning a lot of gears because they might as well not be profitable all the time. And there's going to be someone else who's more competitive and comes up with a different device that is more efficient in terms of using electricity and so on. So it's a competitive scene. But we are making these assumptions that miners are evil and therefore you should not trust them or not allow anything to be ran or managed by them. And this goes back to the drive chains debate because that's the main criticism against it. They say, no, this is trusted because you have to trust that the miners, a majority of hash rate, is going to act in an honest way, which means that they're going to collect fees as opposed to rug pulling everyone as part of that
What's
setup.
Paul's rebuttal to that? The 6 month like time limit or whatever?
Count to 13,000. That's his rebuttal. You need 13,000 blocks until you either close the sidechain or
And that's like
you.
roughly like 6 months or something, right? Or is it like 3 months? It's like it's some like really long period of time like that, isn't it?
Well, you need, I think it was 25% of nodes to be able to unfreeze the funds. But honestly, I think the solution is to soft fork. So every time you have a majority of miners that's being dishonest and takes away the funds, you're going to have to soft fork to release the funds to the rightful owners, according to a state that was available previous to the establishment of this sidechain. But honestly, I don't know what to say.
Well, with Stacks, Stacks is like a pretend side chain for Bitcoin where they're supposed to have like smart contracts and stuff like Ethereum style stuff on Bitcoin, right? And I think Stacks like it doesn't have miners like per se, but the like with the way they like peg funds in and out, like the miners have to like mine those transactions, and the miners were like behaving in such a way that they were like basically giving themselves all the block rewards. So I can't say that that's like a thing that wouldn't happen. Like the miners, if given the opportunity, they're going to act in their own best interest, right? And like I don't know, like I'm not familiar enough with drive chain to see how like that would be stopped unless it was private by default, and then all transactions look the same and there's no incentive to like front run.
I think privacy solves a lot of problems.
Yeah, I do too.
Need to find a way to promote it, to explain to people that there's nothing inherently evil about it. There's nothing criminal about wanting privacy. It's just a matter of making this system more efficient, making it work in the way that we pretend that it works, right? It's not sound money without privacy. You can't have systems where the miners can't discriminate between transactions without privacy. I guess what they can do is refuse to take transactions from a certain node, right? So that's the only layer of discrimination. But then you're gonna have another node copying the mempool from the other one. So it propagates in this peer-to-peer network in a way that cannot single out a single node. Maybe by IP address, but that's why we have Tor.
Yeah, I mean, there's things that have been proposed for Bitcoin to obfuscate. I always have trouble saying that word. Obfuscate your IP address. Like Monero and several other privacy coins have implemented Dandelion Plus Plus, which
I do
prevents like
remember that one. It was proposed for Bitcoin. Whatever happened to it?
it's in a bunch of privacy coins now. And Bitcoin, I don't think ever adopted it. Like that's one of the things that like has really like made me like I guess like solidified my transition to like being way more interested in privacy
Don't call
coins.
it
Just like
transition, please.
okay, all right, my
Your
change of
switch.
heart. Yeah, my change of heart. So like all these things that were proposed for Bitcoin and rejected are now being put to use in the wild, like for these privacy blockchains. And like when people say like Bitcoin's open source, like if there's any innovation from altcoins, like Bitcoin will just implement it. Like we're seeing the reverse happen, which is kind of crazy. Like there's technology that was proposed for Bitcoin rejected, and now it's being implemented in altcoins, and it seems to be a better design decision, in my opinion.
That's beautiful. It's open source software. Who's stopping us from using it? Well, it's just our idea of what software should be like and our perception of value. People will say, I think I read a tweet by Super Testnet yesterday. I have a lot of respect for the guy, but he's trying to follow this ideological line to basically prove that whatever he says about Bitcoin is true and Monero is inferior by default. But he did say that it was about Lightning being superior to Monero. I
Yeah,
mean,
I
there are
publicly
some ways
disagreed with him, and
because you don't need a blockchain, you don't have to wait for confirmations, it's instant. You can use Tor or VPN behind your channels so that it's very hard to identify who sent the transaction, but the receiver of the transaction doesn't get much privacy, and that's an issue with Lightning. And I think long-term Lightning can be an interesting research project. It can be used for a lot of stuff, including building these cross-chain exchanges for atomic swaps. That
I
was one of the use
disagree.
cases.
It would be cool. Like I hope I'm wrong, and you're right, but I totally disagree. I think Lightning is a dumpster fire, like the Bcash video said, and I see no future for it. Like it's had a decade almost. Like if it was a good layer two, like people would have adopted it. Like instead, people chose to use Litecoin.
Well, you know how the meme goes. Just wait another 18 months and it's gonna be ready.
Yeah, but I don't know. Like I personally don't have any hope for Lightning. Like one, it's not private. Two, like there's just so many problems with it to make it usable in any way. Like basically, it has to be custodial to be usable, unless you are highly motivated to put a lot of time and effort into like rebalancing channels, managing liquidity, dealing with technical issues. Whenever LND decides to change something, responding to a high fee environment when your channels are forced closing and that kind of thing. So it's like, and that's the worst part of it to me is like that it doesn't work when there's high fees. That was the entire point of Lightning, right? Like Bitcoin fees were getting too high, so we need something else like on layer 2. And whenever the fees spike, Lightning starts falling apart. So like, yeah, no, I have no hope for Lightning. Like I think they need to go back to the drawing board or consider a way to scale on chain.
I think I heard this point from Paul Storz during a panel when he said that Lightning does compete for fees with Bitcoin miners, and there's an incentive for Bitcoin miners to destroy it on the long term. If Lightning is gonna end up getting a lot of fees and the base layer doesn't, then there is an incentive for the miners to destroy Lightning. And
Yeah, and I think it's going to either lead to a tail emission if there are layer 2s that are taking the fees off the base layer, like it's affecting the security budget. There's already not, like too much incentive to hodl and not use your Bitcoin. So there's already the problem of having fees to replace like the block subsidy when it disappears or when it keeps getting reduced through every halving. And like I think we're kind of seeing like the first like pains of this security budget problem right now post halving, with like all these mining companies just bleeding out and looking into AI and like mining Caspa and all this shit that we've been seeing them do to try to stay afloat, because there's no base layer transactions, and then the base layer transactions that should be there are being pushed to Lightning. So yeah, I do see that as a huge problem, and I do see miners being incentivized to destroy it, or Lightning causing fundamental instability in the Bitcoin network due to the fact that fees are not replacing the diminishing block subsidy. It's going
well,
to lead
I
to tail
disagree
emission.
with you there. There are at least 3,000 transactions in every block that you can watch right now in the mempool. So there is activity. You don't find blocks that don't fill. You don't find blocks that are below 1 megabyte, which is
How
supposed
much
to
of
be
that is
up.
real transactions though? Like a lot of that's just like exchanges and people sending
Well,
their
how is
Bitcoin
that
back and
not a real transaction?
I mean like some of it's like batching, like some of it's uh like lightning transactions settling on chain. I would say that like it's not so much like economic activity, like real economic activity of like people spending their Bitcoin on goods and services. It's more like sending Bitcoin to trade it or taking it off the exchange. Like,
Yeah, maybe, but it's still economic activity. It's still a user.
yeah, I guess. I mean, I don't know. Like, I feel like the economic activity on Monero, for instance, is like real economic activity because people are using it to buy drugs, right? Like they're using it on the dark web, ransomware, people are using it. Whereas like Bitcoin activity to me is not as organic. I feel like it's contrived a little bit.
It's hard to argue with that, but at the same time, it's beautiful that we don't know for certain. Maybe that there are some other entities like exchanges that have more information about where the Bitcoin goes and how many users are actually using it. Because usually the metric for determining the amount of users is looking at the UTXOs. And they say, oh, there are this many UTXOs, but this should mean that we have this number of users. It's not really true. I think every Bitcoin user has a bunch of UTXOs. Even if they have only one wallet, they're going to have a lot of UTXOs within that wallet. And I guess there's fewer of us than we like to believe.
Yeah,
But
could be.
I'm still optimistic. I still think that there's gonna be a big wake up at one point where we realize, okay, we have these problems. How are we going to solve them? How are we going to make sure that miners don't discriminate between transactions? How are we gonna make sure that there's an economy for this? Honestly, if Bitcoin got privacy and also increased the block size, many of the problems would be fixed, even if the block size increase was minimal. And I can argue that 16 megabyte blocks or even 32 would not even impact the decentralization that we have right now. I
That's a
think the
pity about
proposal,
Bitcoin Cash, like because they have 32 megabyte blocks, right? But because they have such like a bad reputation among like Bitcoiners, like no Bitcoiner will try to transact through Bitcoin Cash. And I would love to see like a stress test of Bitcoin Cash's scalability.
well,
I would love to see it under BTC transaction amounts, like that kind of demand, and see how it performs. Because like if it had that kind of stress test to demonstrate to the world that, oh, okay, maybe what they did is not so bad, maybe we could see something like that come to Bitcoin.
the gamble that the BCH people are making right now is assuming that there is an economy that they haven't tapped yet. And there's this community of people who want to use Bitcoin transactions at scale with low fees. And they're going to be able to basically onboard all of these people to their network and have this peer-to-peer economy, this agorist wet dream of having an economy that's based entirely on their currency. But it never happened. I think they had a pretty good start. I do remember that every payments processor and ATM and exchange that were supporting BTC also had support for BCH. It's just that they didn't find that user base. They were not able to identify who really wants to make these transactions and use this currency. It was a bunch of advocates and enthusiasts, but they were saying at one point that it only takes one African country, but it seems like Tether has eaten the lunch of pretty much everyone who's hoping that you're going to have free market money inside of a country that needs to get rid of its fiat currency, which is devaluing. Seems like there's more desire and demand for the US dollar. And there isn't much you can do about it. We're living in this world where even Bitcoiners, when they pretend to be maximalists, they're evaluating everything in US dollars.
And they'll still have
Michael
Tether
Saylor,
in Aqua
you
Wallet and
you're
stuff like
gonna
that.
say that Michael Saylor is the biggest Bitcoin bull, but he still talks about US dollars and he portrays Bitcoin in a way that's complementary to the US dollar, says it's this great store of value to make more dollars. So we're not getting rid of the US dollar, and I think BCH is more ideological and is pretty pure in this pursuit, but at the same time, I don't think the world is ready for that. And it's an ugly truth because Roger Ver keeps saying that Expedia and Steam and Microsoft were accepting Bitcoin and they stopped accepting when the fees got high, and that was the way to get adoption. Why didn't these companies accept BCH? That's my
Because
question.
the fracturing of the community, like before the fork wars, like Bitcoin was like one community, right? There was like Ethereum and stuff, but like most of the crypto community was in Bitcoin. And you can also see this like with the Bitcoin dominance, how before the fork wars, Bitcoin's dominance was like 80-90%, and after the fork wars it dropped to like 50%. So the segmentation of the community and then the toxicity between the two communities, and then the clear outcome of like the exchanges going with BTC and BTC like keeping the ticker, and you know all the interest like economically, those things had like a combined effect that kind of undermined BCH. And I would say that BCH like up until like now has been in the shadow of Bitcoin because of those reasons. And like the toxicity from the fork was people calling it like fake Bitcoin, and like Roger's meltdown when he did that interview with John Carvalho, that left a lasting impression on people. And like when people thought of BCH, they just thought of like Roger melting down on John Carvalho's podcast and said, "Yeah, I'm not going near that shit." And it's been that way
I don't
since
think
then.
Microsoft or Expedia or Steam really care about this stuff.
No, they stopped because the fees. Bitcoin became prohibitively expensive to use.
Yeah, but when something else came along, like BCH, like Litecoin, like Ethereum, when it still had low fees, they didn't care.
Yeah, but like
It's
crypto
also
in general
interesting
was
that
like so new. You know what I mean? Like when businesses first started accepting Bitcoin, like it was in the shadow of Bitcoin being dark web money. It had like an unsavory reputation. So like for them to take a chance on any crypto, obviously they're only going to go for the most important one, which was Bitcoin. And then once it became prohibitively expensive, like non-crypto people that run these companies were like, "Oh, not that shit's not worth it. We're just going to go back to PayPal and credit cards." And that was it. You know, they're not going to
but
take a chance
that's
on
another side
some
of the
other
story.
like cryptocurrency that's even sketchier than Bitcoin, like when Bitcoin was already sketchy for being dark web money.
That's another side of the story which I guess doesn't get told because there's this whole fintech revolution. You had companies like Venmo, like Revolut,
Zelle,
Zelle, Square. I think that's the only one that's profitable from Jack Dorsey. Square.
yeah.
That's the one from which he makes money. And maybe Tidal, but I'm not sure about Tidal because it's trying to be like Spotify, but for some exclusive artists. I'm not sure if that one is actually
I don't
getting.
think it makes money. I think he just bought that one to like hang out with Jay-Z.
Maybe. that that's a weird reason to buy companies. But my point is that there was this whole fintech revolution that happened in parallel to Bitcoin having its identity crisis. And companies, I guess in the beginning, Bitcoin had a pretty cool user experience where you were sending coins and people were saying, yeah, it's immutable, which means that there's not going to be a chargeback and it works on the internet and it's nice. You scan this QR code and you make the payment. But in the meantime, you had much better UX being built by these companies working on these interfaces, which are basically layers of banking. So they built a layer on top of the banking layer, which is already a layer free. You have the central banks, and then you have cash, and you have credit cards on top of cash, and you have banks that issue these credit cards. So I guess that's a layer free. So you had the layer force of traditional finance that came along, and then they gained a lot of popularity because they're simple. And you get this name that you can associate with your phone number so you can just send money to someone's phone. It's so convenient and easy to use. And they were able to take some of that attention and get integrated with payment services, with shops, with everything else, and get some of that commerce activity and effectively increase the demand for fiat currency. Because the average person, I guess they don't care about buying Bitcoin or Monero or whatever for the purpose of making a basic payment that they can make with their cards.
I
It
have a
makes
question
sense if
for
you
you.
want to support a quest. Okay, go ahead.
Did before Bitcoin, did you like understand money and how it worked and like central banks and like inflation and this kind of thing? Or did you find out about that like as you became a Bitcoiner and learned about Bitcoin?
Honestly, I've always hated banks, but I didn't really understand why until I got into Bitcoin.
Okay.
So,
I would say
I,
like your average person doesn't understand why they should care about Bitcoin. Like that's why they don't, because they don't understand money.
even Bitcoiners don't. You get guys like Jimmy Song and Samson Mao who brag about spending with their credit cards. And they say, oh, I earned points and miles on my flights app or whatever.
And then also, if you don't know like that inflation is like robbing you and like you don't understand money, like of course you're not going to use some weird open source money like project when there's an app on your phone that everyone else you know uses. Like right now, like messaging apps are like a good analogy. Like there's so many different messaging apps, but there's like two or three that are super popular because most people use one of them. Like WhatsApp is one of them, Telegram is one of them. and then maybe Signal, like as a distant third. There's superior messaging systems out there. There's things like SimpleX. It's so hard to get like a normal person, like to get like my one of my family members that's not concerned with like open source software or privacy or anything, like to get them to use something other than WhatsApp or Telegram is like impossible. And I would say that like with the emergence of these fintech apps, like crypto is just too much of a learning curve for the average person, which is why I don't think there's going to be mass adoption unless like the UI dramatically improves or something happens, like you said, that forces people to seek out like an alternative, or like education dramatically spreads about like why privacy and like self custody and things like that are important.
Well, I think it takes some time for you to get here. What I find interesting is that every cycle, every single bull market cycle, we get this new invention of a use case which sounds ridiculous but gets mainstream attention. We had the ICO, and then we had the NFT, and these were basically
Security tokens, stable coins.
the vehicles that were pushing mainstream adoption. Nobody was talking about what Bitcoin is doing on Jimmy Fallon. They were talking about CryptoKitties and whatever ICO, or they were talking about Paris
Dogecoin.
Hilton having some sort of NFT, and then he got Jimmy Fallon to also get this .eth address and send Bored Apes, and then you had Eminem and Snoop Dogg doing a music video with their Bored Ape avatars, which I found both hilarious and at the same time disturbing. And this is how you get to the mainstream, because you get people who don't give a rat's ass about Bitcoin. They don't care about any of this stuff. They don't know about being a libertarian, being sovereign, caring about freedom of transactions, about privacy, about protocols to make internet anonymous. They don't care about anything. They just want something fun, and they want to make money off of it. So if it's fun and you make money off of it, it's gonna onboard some people. If 10% of these people are going to discover the reasons why this technology exists in the first place, and they're going to study, maybe 1% is going to study the cypherpunk culture, but it's still a net benefit, because we already got to all the libertarians, we already got to all the agorists and all the crazy sovereign individuals and everyone who cares about this stuff. We have them on. They're on board. Maybe not all the gold bugs, but that's another fight which maybe is not worth fighting. It it gets ridiculous to convince people like Peter Schiff to join Bitcoin. They're not gonna, because their incentives are stacked against it. But then you're gonna get mass adoption through these open source layers, right? You have Ethereum, which I still believe that is a layer 2 or 3 of Bitcoin. Of course, it creates monetary inflation because it has this monetary policy, its own currency. It competes with Bitcoin to a certain degree. But in terms of experimenting with technology and experimenting with the social layer to get more people to care about this tech without actually thinking how it works, I think they did a pretty good job. And I think because of these people and because of the adoption that we're going to get with these stupid memes and narratives, we're actually going to get more development in the space, and we're going to push Bitcoin forward. The problem is that you have the counter, you have the response from people like Michael Saylor, who are pushing for this extreme conservatism, which opposes anything which resembles innovation under the veil of shitcoinery and the kind of tech that you don't want to put on Bitcoin ever. And they're pushing for complacency. And as long as the number goes up, everyone agrees that there's nothing that needs to be done, right? But I believe that once the number stops going up and people wake up and they see that they surrendered their freedom of transactions, they surrendered their sovereignty to these institutions that promised to make the number go up and they didn't, they're gonna push for some change, and they're gonna realize, okay, Bitcoin is serving this use case which no longer makes us make money, you know? So how do we make money? Well, let's tap into this internet commerce market, you know? Let's see if anyone accepts Bitcoin for these transactions. It's been maybe by that time it will be 20 something years. And they will realize that they do need to create the type of use cases that they rejected during the block size wars. They said, "Oh, this is not important. It's we should focus on building a store of value because that's how you get to the medium of exchange." Eventually, you're gonna see that most of the stuff that today is taboo and is no longer being discussed and is unpopular is gonna make a comeback. I think we're already seeing a renaissance, and some of these masterminds are very much aware of what's happening with covenants, stuff like Opcat. If Opcat gets passed, you're gonna have Ethereum rollups coming into Bitcoin, and Ethereum rollups bring some pretty good privacy and scalability. I spoke with this guy who created this Zcash like system, which is called Starks. You have ZK Snarks that lay at the foundation of Zcash, and then you have ZK Starks, which basically can create some of the same cryptography without the trusted setup. And a lot of builders can come to the original chain because there's a lot of money inflows that come to it. And of course, they want to tap into that liquidity. I am very optimistic about what's going to happen in the future. I'm trying not to let myself get depressed because something is not happening right now. But at the same time, I also believe that it's important to have a straight narrative about the cypherpunk origins of the project and remind people, it was supposed to be like this. If at one point down the road we decided that privacy was important and scalability was important, we could have had something like Monero or Zcash. Maybe you should look into how these work and play with them. And if you can make some money with them, but you should also hold Bitcoin to the same standards. And if we get enough people from the degens who enter because they like ordinals, and then they start running the full node because they want to not pay a fee when they mint ordinals to some third-party service, and then they discover more about how the system works and they demand more from it, I think that's how we get there. For better and for worse, it seems like this narrative of commerce and bringing people to spend their BTC did not get too far. But we have these meme coins and NFTs and situations where people who otherwise would never care about this technology end up caring about it because they can make money off of it.
Mhm.
And at one point, they're gonna come to the project that, or the projects, because I believe I don't just believe, I hope that the future is multi chain for the simple reason that you should always have something conservative and something that pushes the limits of what is possible and what is considered to be possible. And you're going to have more development, you're going to have more users, you're going to have more scaling debates. I think the ordinal inscriptions have already pushed the scaling debate once again.
Do you
And
think ordinals are a net positive?
yeah,
Yeah.
very much. You
Okay.
can argue, okay, they're bloating the UTXO set. They're bloating, they're making syncing a full node slower. Fine. But the net benefit is that a lot of capital went into alternatives to the Lightning Network. A lot of money went to Arc. A lot of money went to drive chains. A lot of money went to Fediments for better and for worse. And we're going to see them compete. And we're going to see which one ends up becoming popular on the markets that they expect. And it's
What do you
beautiful.
what do you think about all these roll-ups that they're doing now?
Well, they're exotic for Bitcoin because for the longest time, the holy grail for scaling was the sidechain. And now
Mhm.
you get the rollup, which is a fancy way of batching transactions with zero knowledge proofs. I think it's interesting and useful. Honestly, why would I opt or cheer or fanboy for one type of scaling when you have all of these options and you can let them all do, roll out and see how they manage to get market traction and then choose the best one for yourself. Of course, none of them is going to have Zcash level of privacy except for the Zcash drive chain, and none of them is going to have the fungibility of Monero, and Bitcoin is still trading like this NFT. I think Bitcoin is the ultimate NFT right now. because you
Yeah, I would say it's the original NFT, and I've said that like to Bitcoin maxis, and they, to troll them or whatever, like in the past, like, but it is a non-fungible token, like to be honest.
it is. And the funny part about it is that you have these quote unquote tainted coins, and once the government seizes them and sells them, they become clean again. So there's this political fungibility mechanism, and there's also the built-in fungibility mechanism where if you pay transaction fees with these tainted coins, they are taken by the miners and issued as a block reward, and they re-enter the economy as clean coins. So that's also beautiful.
Do you think this is going to be the last question because you've been super generous with your time, but we're going on 2 hours, so I know you're probably getting tired of talking. Um, do you think that something like Litecoin's solution of Mimble Wimble extension blocks, if it was added to Bitcoin, would be sufficiently private to kind of alleviate this while still keeping the maximalist vision of a transparent, verifiable chain alive?
I think so. MWeb is not quite Mimblewimble, is not quite Grin. And a bunch of people, when they hear Mimblewimble, they think about Trace Mayer and what he did in 2020 when he launched Mimblewimble coin as this Ponzi that was basically his excuse to leave the community, because he also has a book that's called How to Disappear, and you can find that on Amazon. So I'm pretty sure that this was his exit plan. For some reason, Mimblewimble has a bad reputation among Bitcoiners, and they don't even care to look at what they did in Litecoin, where they got the top Grin developer and they made him work on this, and they made it have addresses, because in Mimblewimble, in the pure version of it, you don't have addresses and you cannot receive coins when you're not online. So this guy was able to figure out, his name is David Burkett, and he was able to figure out how to make this happen. And it's pretty cool because it works just like a sidechain, but it has the privacy of something like confidential transactions while being more scalable. It's a very nice trade-off, if you ask me, because of course it's not as good as Monero when it comes to privacy, but it's more scalable. It's not as good as Zcash, but at the same time it's private by default on that layer. It only requires the soft fork to get activated, so it's not politically unpopular. If it was to happen, it's gonna happen. But at the same time, I think there's not enough push for it. It can also double down as a block size increase, right? You can make the extension block have 10 megabytes or something. And then you're going to get a lot of economic activity, including maybe opening lightning channels or whatever on the extension block. That is very much possible. It's just that the incentives are not stacked for activating this. And I don't know, maybe in a few years after this one gets a lot of users, and I do encourage people to try Mimblewimble extension block on Litecoin. All you have to do is download the Electrum wallet that is compatible with this. It's built by a guy named Hector. And if you don't trust this fork of a fork, basically, because it's a fork of Bitcoin Electrum for Litecoin, and there's a fork of that that's designed to support Mimblewimble. So if you don't trust that, go to litecoin.org and download Litecoin Core and sync a node. It doesn't take too long because Litecoin is not as big as Bitcoin in terms of data. Sync a node and you're gonna have the functionality by default, and then play with it. See what kind of data you can see about the transactions you receive. Ping me on Twitter. I can send you like 0.01 Litecoin, which is 1 million Litoshis or something. That's like 6 cents or something right now. I can send you that with a transaction so that you can see what kind of information you can observe on the blockchain explorer, and you can understand how the user experience works, because it's basically just like Bitcoin, just like the base layer. There's no learning curve. You don't need to understand how something else works like it happens in the case of Lightning, where there's a learning curve to understand what everything is. It just works out of the box, and it's a soft fork. If it doesn't work and it doesn't align with what Bitcoin is trying to do, you can also deactivate a soft fork. It's not the end of the world if you activate a soft fork and it turns out to not be the perfect design. Whenever I ask a developer about Mimblewimble extension block, they say that Mimblewimble is not good enough in terms of privacy, but it's still better than nothing, and that's where I'm getting.
I think I would disagree that it's not good enough because Beam and Grin both have pretty decent privacy. There was like an article that came out like when the Mimblewimble coins and the paper was like published. I don't know if you remember it, but some guy claimed that he was like able to de-anonymize Mimblewimble. And then after talking to the Beam guys and the Grin guys and the Mimblewimble people in Litecoin, those claims were kind of overblown, like on the amount of information that you can actually get about the transactions. Like you might be able to see like that a transaction went like to an account or whatever, but the amounts and there's no addresses in Mimblewimble. Like the information that they're able to get is not as bad as people say. So it's definitely like a privacy improvement. It's a scalability improvement, and then there's like a lot of innovation going on in Beam that they've like built more stuff onto the Mimblewimble protocol and like allowed for like private DeFi. So I think it's definitely something people should look into with an open mind. But
Yeah, but then you're gonna get someone in Bitcoin who says, "I don't have $100 to buy another hard drive to sync my node to also support the extension block." The answer to this one is that you don't have to. You don't have to. It's optional. You can choose not to run that one. And then you're
I would
gonna get
agree.
someone who says, "Oh, but we're gonna need to pay a maintainer for the code base without the extension block and with the extension block." I don't know, man. Like, you're pretending to be part of this economy where you have trillions of dollars that are going into it, and you want to be the new Rockefeller by hodling. But at the same time, when it's about supporting the network, all you can do is a Raspberry Pi and a 1 terabyte SSD, which is like $100, and you can't make the upgrade to 2 terabytes every 3-4 years for reasons I don't know. It's crazy. So in Mimblewimble, you have the pruning situation. So the data from blocks gets removed. It makes no sense for it to get stored as long as you just need the first and the last transaction. You
Mhm.
need to know how much coins were put into the block and how much were spent, and that's enough for keeping the accounting for this network. There's pruning that's happening. You don't need to upgrade your storage just because Mimblewimble is gonna have, let's say, 8 or 10 megabyte blocks. It doesn't mean that you're gonna store 8 or 10 megabytes every 10 minutes. And even if you do, it's gonna get pruned. It's gonna get removed from there. You're just gonna have the data that has to stay there.
I think Mimblewimble is actually a very very interesting protocol. Like I kind of didn't pay attention to it for a while, and then recently I started trying to find out more about it and did like an interview with the Beam guy, like I said, Alex, and then with Artocrat from Grin. And after talking to both of them, like I'm convinced that Mimblewimble would be an easy privacy solution to add to Bitcoin, and you could port it over directly from Litecoin since they share like a similar code base, and it would be opt-in, and it would be really really easy to do, and the benefits like far outweigh the negatives.
Well, the only argument against it that I see is that it's a cop out for adding base layer privacy. And that's what you actually need if you're going to want to make the miners not discriminate between transactions. But if you get to the point where you're so politically involved and you have the political class demanding you that you keep Bitcoin this way, if you want it to be part of some financial arrangement, part of some system, I guess having an extension block or layer 2 makes some sense. And when you peg your coins into the extension block, it's like a locking mechanism. whatever happens on the extension block is private. And when you peg out, if it's not the same amount, it's very hard to trace, especially if there's a lot of liquidity inside of this extension block. So
Yeah, and then Grin even has like a liquidity pool thing where it's like a coin join kind of thing that they have for Grin, where it's like a pool of like all these UTXOs, and you like send your transaction there, and then it like will send a different UTXO out,
yeah,
right? So
it's
like,
beautiful. So if you want to try that, get Litecoin Core, sync a node. I'm pretty sure you have the computer and the storage for it. And even if you don't have the storage, you can prune the node to 2 gigabytes or something. I'm pretty sure you have that for porn, you perv. Anyway, send me a message on Twitter. I'm gonna send you some coins and you can look at the peg in and peg out mechanism. I'm gonna send you from the base layer to your MWeb address. It should start with MWEB. And you're gonna be able to see on the public blockchain how the pegging happens, and then you can send me back the coins and you can see on the public ledger how the peg out happens, what it looks like. And if that's not impressive to you, I don't know what to tell you. Maybe stick to your 2 gigabytes of porn, hentai, or whatever.
and with that, I think we're going to close it out, man. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Vlad. It's been very, very interesting to watch your evolution of ideology from a hardcore Bitcoin maximalist to a multi-coining privacy coiner.
I'm
And
still a hardcore Bitcoin maximalist. It's just that the people who call themselves hardcore Bitcoin maximalists are not. So I'm the OG Bitcoin maximalist. They're not.
okay, fair enough. You could take the title, but I know that I'm not the only one that's been fascinated watching you kind of open your mind to these other ideas in real time. Like it's been very, very encouraging, because like for some of us that are frustrated with the cult surrounding Bitcoin, it's very, very beautiful to watch someone like come out of it and then kind of come to the same conclusions that many of us have once we came out of it as well.
Yeah, it's fun.